So with Angular's revamped animations module, it's pretty easy to add enter and leave animations to elements on the page. For example, I have this list of friends here, and if I add another friend, you can see that these both transition onto the page. If I do another one, you can see that these are transitioning nicely. And that provides a pretty solid user experience. It's organic, it pulls attention to the list in a way that's not intrusive, but it allows the user to develop a nice mental model. But the problem is, there is the sort of subsequent adding of items to these lists, and then there's the initial rendering of the list. So if I were to, for example, toggle this off and then toggle it on, you can see that this bottom list transitions those elements onto the page, because from its point of view, those li elements inside this list are entering the document object model and therefore should be transitioned, which of course, I don't think we can argue that this is a good user experience. It's clearly a poor user experience. What we want is the user experience of this first list, which is to immediately render the initial list and then only animate subsequent elements into the list. So how do we do that? Well, by default, Angular as of 4.2 will block nested transitions. So in order to block the initial rendering of the page, what we have to do is create a transition higher up in the DOM that activates during the same state transition, in this case enter, and therefore will block the elements, the li elements here transitioning onto the page. So let's take a look at the code. So here are my two lists, is showing lists, and you can see these are the things that we're toggling on and off. And both of these have the li with the ngFor loop, and you can see that each of the friends has this @friend animation trigger. And we can jump up here and we can see that the friend animation trigger is an enter trigger, and we're just transitioning the opacity and the transformation, and that's why they're coming in from the right there. But if we look at what makes these two lists different, the first UL that contains the ngFor has this additional animation trigger for block initial render animation. You can see that this UL down here does not. If we jump up and look at what this one does, we can see that it also defines an enter transition, but it's essentially a no-op or no operation transition here. We don't have any duration, we don't have any style changes, we don't have any meaningful way in which the element is actually transitioning. There's no operation taking place. But defining this enter transition is sufficient to flag the UL as transitioning, right? It's sufficient enough to flag this UL as transitioning when it's being rendered on the page, which will therefore block the initial rendering, the initial animations of the initial rendering of the li elements here, right? Because this is the parent, this is the child. The parent always takes precedence during the same transition. Once this is rendered on the page and the state change no longer applies to this animation trigger, subsequent li elements will transition because they are no longer a nested transition, they are simply the transition on the page, right? So again, if we do something like a page refresh, right, that first list doesn't transition because it's being blocked by the UL, that block animation trigger. The second one continues to animate because there is no block. However, they both transition subsequent elements onto the page. So I'm sure there are other ways to accomplish this, but the no-op transition seems to me to be the easiest thing you can possibly do in order to block or conditionally block animations based on the rendering lifecycle. And this is essentially the same thing that we did in AngularJS 1.2 when we had to do when we wanted to block the ng repeat. We would essentially put an ng if on the UL simply to create a transitionable element that would then block the ng repeat. Same exact concept, this time applied to the revamped browser animations module in Angular 4.2. In this case, we're simply creating nested animation triggers that run, quote unquote run because it's a no-op, during the same state transition.